I sat my kids down and I said, when daddy hollers and screams or sometimes hits mommy, and I tell you, because they would get upset and worked up and crying and try to come to my rescue. And I said, and I would always tell you one day we're going to leave. Well, today is the day. Here are 2 garbage bags. One, put all of your favorite toys, and one, put all of your clothes. And we got in the car and we went to my mother's house and hid in her basement for a while and changed the kids' school. And I finished going to culinary school. And as I would walk the streets of Manhattan, I didn't know if he was going to come out of anywhere, out of any, because there are people everywhere in Manhattan, and do something to me. It was the easiest place for him to harm me and just blend in. But I really was at the point where I was like, F it. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die doing what I want to do for once in my life.
I'm Kelty McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Now, today's conversation deals in part with a topic that probably does not apply to any of you, and that is having a kid in your teen years. I know most of you are probably in your late 20s, 30s, maybe early 40s, but today's guest had not one but 2 children by the age of 18. And it's a really important conversation for us to have because it actually touches on and discusses domestic violence, and specifically what happens when you find yourself having had children with a person who is an abuser, and what that means for you, for your children, and for your life and shared lives when you find yourself in this kind of situation. Now, I want to share this in advance. As mentioned, this topic today that we're discussing, we talk about domestic violence. We also talk about sexual abuse. So if this is a topic that's difficult for you to listen to, if this is a story that's going to be challenging for you, I just want to ensure that you are prepared that this is going to be the subject matter. And we will also include some resources in the show notes of today's episode if you are in or suspect that you may be in an abusive relationship or situation. Now, today's guest, Angela, has an incredible story of resilience. She is now the mom to 4 kids. She is a grandma at the ripe old age of 45. She has lived through and seen so much. It is a message of hope, of strength. I promise you are going to be wowed and inspired by her story. It is also, like I say, it's a heavy one. It's a tough one. So get ready for my conversation with Angela. I'd love to just tell you a little bit about her. So please meet Chef Angela Rivera Accomando, who is the CEO and founder of Golden Meals. Golden Meals provides organizations with food boxes and prepared meals, feeding community members struggling with food insecurity. Angela also worked alongside former New York State Senator David Carlucci and Assemblymember Ken Zabrowski in 2019. That partnership led to the change in law to help victims of domestic violence file reports for crimes made against them. Angela has seamlessly merged her passion for nourishing people with a commitment to social justice, a convergence she never anticipated. Please welcome Angela Rivera Accomando to the show. Angela, I am so happy to have you here for this conversation today. I had told Angela that she popped in my mind the other day. We hadn't seen each other, spoken for probably at least 2-3 years. And I had this sudden stroke of inspiration that she is the perfect person we need to hear from this week. So I know you won't be disappointed by anything she has to share, and you're all going to be totally inspired by her and her story. So Angela, to kick us off, what do we need to know about you? And then I want to get right into your Kids Are Child-Free story.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a mom of 4 kids. 3 of them are in their 20s, mid to late 20s now. And I have a 12-year-old. I had my children young in my teens. I was a teen mom. And then my youngest one I had in my early 30s. So I have the experience of, having kids young, having kids older, and having older kids, being a grandmother. I'm also a grandmother now, and being a mom to a young child. And so I have a lot of parent experience.
No kidding. Yeah. And I'm glad that for people watching the video, that you mentioned you had your kids really young, because I mean, I don't want to say you don't look a day over 35 or how old are you today? Can we ask?
Yes. So on October 31st, I will be 45.
Okay. All right. So
And
grandma at
so,
45.
yeah. And so I had my first child a month before my 17th birthday.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. I'm curious, when you were young, did you want to have kids? Did you assume you would have kids? What's the story there?
Yeah, I mean, I always knew I would have kids. I had a little babysitting business. I was like, just the kind of person that loved kids and would pick kids up and play with them. And so I knew I always wanted kids. Did I plan to have them at 16 years old? No, that was a series of events that happened.
Yeah.
And it took a large chunk of my, early life away.
Yeah.
And now part of what I'm going through is, my husband, I'm married a second time. So my husband that I'm married to now, he has one child with me and we're both the same age. We went to school together. And so he had, up until he was in his 30s, time to travel across Europe and Australia and like just do what he wanted to do, go to college,
Yeah.
go to culinary school. And when everybody was at prom, I was changing Pampers. So now I'm
Wow.
in this place in my life where I'm like, I want to travel through Europe, backpack through Europe and do some of these things. And, but I still have responsibilities. So
Yeah.
it's interesting navigating through that and trying to find a way, which I do with going on my retreats. And, my husband's really amazing with like, so do what you want to do. But for me, I'm more like, well, we have this business and I don't want my 12-year-old to think I abandoned him. But it's definitely a thing that's coming up for me lately.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. You've had responsibilities for such a good part of your life, right? From an age when most people were going to prom and
Yeah.
flying off to Europe and getting up to all sorts of mischief and not thinking about having and raising kids or having a business. And I know you've had an incredible growth journey through it all, which we're going to talk about. And I sometimes hear from people who've had their kids young, like you're also, you, for example, are going to be, and we'll talk about this as well. Are you ever really finished rearing your children?
Yeah.
Right. But you will have a different kind of freedom than probably a lot of people, let's say in their mid late 40s, early 50s, who, to contrast it with, in the last week, I've had two friends in their early 40s have their first child. So yeah, it's interesting when you've done things in some sense. Well, we could say both of those are like the extreme ends,
Mm-hmm.
early 40s, teens, but it definitely changes and shapes your whole life. I'm interested to hear, as you mentioned, it was not a plan to have kids so young. Were you with a partner, a boyfriend at the time when you became pregnant? And how did that all play out when you found out you were pregnant? Did you know that you were going to keep your child? Were there talks of, adoption, abortion? How did that all unfold?
Yeah, I mean, my early life story is quite a story. So I can kind of wrap it up because we could do an hour or two podcast on that alone. Is
Yeah.
I grew up with a mother who had a lot of her own trauma, being raised by a schizophrenic mother and then being put in foster care. And so I really longed for love and connection most of my life.
Yeah.
And I actually got pregnant by a much older man. He was 23 years older than me, right? So it was something that should have never happened.
Yes.
And, I grew up just kind of shuffled between houses, my mother's house, my father's house. The first 5 years of my life, I grew up in my great grandparents' house. I lived with my aunt and uncle for a little while. And then at the end, I went to live with my mother and she really kind of pushed me on this older man that I was dating and said, can't you go live with him? And so, yeah, so when I got pregnant, honestly, there was no talk of adoption or abortion because I desperately wanted somebody to love. I desperately wanted that family that I didn't have. And the funny thing with me is like, I live in New York. And so when people hear my story, they're like, oh, you grew up in the South Bronx, right? I'm like, no, I never lived in the Bronx. I actually grew up in a very like Caucasian, Republican, conservative neighborhood with an Irish mother that just had a lot of trauma, and I always say like behind those white picket fences, stuff still goes on.
Yeah. Such a good reminder. And also, a reminder to people not to make assumptions, right? We
Yeah.
see a certain story and we think, oh, I've got that all figured out. I know where you're from. I know what you're
Yeah.
about. It's like fits a certain stereotype.
Yeah.
So, okay. So you had your daughter, your eldest daughter. Is that correct?
No, my daughter's number 3. I actually had my
Okay.
oldest son.
Your oldest son. Okay. So were you going to school while you had your child? Did you drop out of school? What happened there?
Yeah, so I did drop out of school. I got my GED, which in America, that's like the equivalent of a high school diploma. I got it quickly and
Mm-hmm.
passed with, flying colors. I had actually been going to a private Christian school at the time. Yeah, so I dropped out. I actually went to cosmetology school, and
Mm-hmm.
we're talking 28 years ago, right? And got a license to do nails.
Mm-hmm.
And because one of the things is I always wanted to make sure that I was able to take care of myself. That was a really, really important thing because
Mm.
my mother always depended on men who were very abusive, and she depended on the system, which is fine. It's there for people, but it's something that I didn't want because the
Mm-hmm.
system does keep you trapped.
Mm.
And so for me, I was like, okay, I've always had this entrepreneurial spirit in me. Like,
Yeah.
even when I lived in the apartment building with my mother, I sold lemonade and cookies on the side of the street when I was like 6 and 7. So I always had that in me. So I went to school and got my cosmetology license and rented a little booth. And then, that didn't work out because it takes time to kind of build up a clientele, and I needed money like now.
Yeah.
So actually, I'll back up a little. While I was going to school, when I was pregnant, I worked at a bakery that was like a block away from my house. I've always had a good work ethic. So I worked, went to school. Then when I got my license, I started doing nails and hair. And then I got pregnant like 3 months later with my second son. So
Okay.
here I am, 17 with one kid, pregnant with another.
And was this, and I hope you don't mind me asking, was this
Sure.
the same father? Are you still with the father
Yes.
of, okay. So
Yep.
you're in a relationship. He's like you're parenting together.
Yep.
You're living together.
Yep.
Okay. So you now have a second child.
So we have a second child on the way. I will
Okay.
say that child, there were discussions of terminating the pregnancy because now I'm like freaked out. Like, I have this little baby that
Mm-hmm.
my partner, who ended up becoming my husband, we got married like a couple years later when I became legal at 18. And
Mm-hmm.
so he worked nights and then I worked days, and that's kind of how we covered childcare. But
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh God, here's another baby. And, I really went back and forth with having that child or not. A family member talked me into keeping the baby, which I'm glad I did. He is like my best friend. But I also realized that our financial situation was not going to be enough because even though he was 23 years older than me, he was uneducated, which I hate to say that because there are plenty of people that have tons of education and don't make enough money to pay their bills. So I hate like saying things like that, but he didn't have a lot of skills. So I had to figure out like, what are we going to do to really sustain ourselves and thrive as a
Mm-hmm.
family? And at the time, his sister actually got him a job as like a supervisor to a big cleaning company. And I was just
Okay.
like, if you can do this for a big company, you could do it for us. Let's start our own cleaning business. And we did in a very humble way. We took like $10 and went to the dollar store and got cleaning supplies and some business cards. And he went out door to door to, offices and stuff. And it started out with like extremely big houses, cleaning them for like $50. But it was a start that led
Mm-hmm.
to the next thing, which was cleaning their offices. A lot of them were lawyers and doctors. And I built a 6-figure company with
Wow.
$10 in cleaning supplies.
Amazing. You've always been entrepreneurial. I mean, I know you as a business owner, but you're not kidding when you say like tough start, right? You talk about your early upbringing, the family situation, now having 2 children, having you had your second son, you were 17, is that correct? 18?
Yeah, so they are true Irish twins. They are a year and
Okay.
5 days apart. So I had my second son a month before my 18th birthday.
Oh my gosh. And I got to say, Angela, when you first said, I thought you said he was 23, but he was 23 years older than you.
23 years older than me.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So I was 16 and he was like 39.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lots of complexities with that
Oh,
relationship then. Like you
yes.
say, I mean, that's a whole other, I'm sure,
That is a whole other
problematic,
episode.
a whole other episode, a whole other topic. What did you think of? I mean, okay, you're effectively a child yourself. You now have two
Mm-hmm.
children. What were those early years like? I mean, you're trying to make financial ends meet. You're swapping off childcare to be able to do so. How did you like being a mom when you had those young children? What were the challenges? What were the joys?
I think the challenges were just, I had to grow up really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just growing up to be a mom. It was growing up to be responsible and a good business person so I could thrive, because I knew, like, if I'm not successful at this business, I'm going to have to go work for somebody and it's going to be for a lot less money.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not what I wanted. Right. I really always had this vision of, I want to buy a house for my kids, which I ended up doing with an FHA loan at 18 years old. It was a
Wow.
fixer upper, but I did it. So I always I always say, like, my drive and my vision is what
Mm.
kept me going.
Mm-hmm.
But having them that young and being that young, I will say, like, the pros about it is, like, I
Yeah.
was able to keep up with them, because
Mm-hmm.
two children, like, now at 45, I couldn't do it and I wouldn't want to do it. And I
Mm-hmm.
give
Mm-hmm.
people a lot of credit who do it at my age, because I have
Mm-hmm.
friends who are like having kids now. But I
Yeah.
had a lot of energy in those younger years to keep up with them. I think that was kind of the pro to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And what was the dynamic like with your husband in terms of rearing those children together? You know, what were challenges that you faced? What were there dynamics in that relationship that worked well as far as parenting together?
I mean, I guess I would say the things that worked well is that he was very, like, young in the mind and young spirited too.
Mm-hmm.
And he did pitch in a lot to wake up at night, change Pampers, and
Mm-hmm.
cook and things like that. Yeah.
Okay. So there was a partnership there as well as,
Yeah, for sure.
in the sense of as as all partners of the childbearing person should be, but to do the things that are involved to raise children.
Can I just say that I always
Please.
have to tell people that with that relationship, it's
Mm-hmm.
always holding space for the this and the this, right? In this hand, it was, this shouldn't have happened. This was
Mm-hmm.
abuse in so many ways. He was very abusive.
Mm-hmm.
And then in this hand, I have to hold the things that are also true about him,
Yeah.
which were, he did wake up and change Pampers and, hustle with the business and things like that. So it's always
Yeah.
holding space for both, which is hard
Yeah.
for people sometimes. And it was hard for me for a long time.
It is, yeah. And I appreciate you neither romanticizing it and also giving credit where credit is due, if you will. And
Mm-hmm.
not to say like, oh, but the complexities of a human and a relationship, and
Yes.
that it can be so many things. It contains
Yes.
multitudes. I want to actually get back to the question about idealization. And actually, let's go there first. And then I would like to talk a little bit more about that relationship dynamic, specifically as it pertains to raising children together. I think a lot of women in particular, but people in general, have romanticized, idealized notions of what it is to have and raise children. Specifically when we think about babies and toddlers and those sort of years. Of course, you were also very young at the time. So you probably, you had certainly seen and experienced a lot, but perhaps not to the extent of you've got all these friends who are also having kids and et cetera. Although I'm curious, did you know other people who had kids at that point, other friends, or was it really yourself doing that on your own?
At that point, I had moved from where I grew up to
Mm-hmm.
living with my mother, and I had disconnected with a lot of my friends. And then the man who I had children with, who later became my husband, was so controlling. I had no friends. I was
Wow.
really cut off from everybody.
Okay. Okay. What were the sort of romantic notions you had about what it was to be a mom or have kids? Like, was there a picture in your head? And then how did reality compare to that?
Yeah, so the picture in my head was pretty much what I fantasized to have as a mother when I was a kid, right?
Mm,
It's like that picture perfect. Like, it's funny. My mom was a beautiful woman, and she was very sexy and she dressed very sexy, but I wanted a mom who crocheted.
mm-hmm.
And, my life was always very interesting because, like I said, I grew up in a really good neighborhood. My mother lived in like the only apartment complex in that neighborhood. My dad lived up the road in a nice house in that same
Mm-hmm.
neighborhood. And my aunts and uncles lived in nice houses. So I think from seeing that being mirrored to me with other people in my family, like that's what I really dreamed about. And I really worked so hard to be the mother that I needed and wanted.
Mm,
Right. Because my mother left me for the first 5 years of my life. So I lived with my great grandparents. So for me,
okay.
it was just like being there for my kids. And, even at a young age, like I was like, I want them to go to the best schools. I want them to have their own room. Like I just wanted them to have the childhood better than what I even
Yeah.
wanted for myself.
Yeah. It's so interesting because I think, and certainly perhaps your situation, we can say there's certain extremes that maybe other people haven't experienced, but I know people who had difficult upbringings for whatever reason, due to neglect or abuse or any sort of trauma they experienced. There's this sort of tension where they're on the fence, where on the one hand, in some ways it pulls them away from wanting kids because they see like they don't want their kids to experience what they did, or the
Mm-hmm.
risk that there could be similar situation that their kids find themselves in is what they experienced. And at the same time, there's often this desire to have and offer a different kind of childhood, a different kind of child rearing experience, and upbringing for their kids than what they got to have. And so I'm interested for you, like, did you ever have a fear or at any point in the process of having and raising kids of like, what if I screw up in the same way? Or am I repeating past patterns? Or has it always been this sort of like opportunity to do over or do better?
Yeah, no, I never really thought about that. It was for me always an opportunity to like do over and do
Hmm.
better,
Yeah.
like, and that put a lot of pressure on me too. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I
Yeah.
was already so young, handling so much, right? Like two kids. I ended up having my daughter now a year and a half after I had
Okay.
my second son. So they're all like really close in age. Right. And so I had the pressure of like being there and, being their mom and like, okay, I'm buying this house and now I got to fix the house up because it was a foreclosure. I want them to live in a nice house. And when their friends come over and I want them to, be in all these things that kids should be in, right? Like, oh,
Hmm.
I want to put them in gymnastics and karate and ballet. And I did. And like running them
Yeah.
all over the place. Now I'm like so anti all of that. It's not funny
Okay.
with my
Interesting.
youngest. But
Yeah.
at that time, it was just really like, I have this vision of what I want my life to be, which is like my dream life of the house and the kids and my daughter in ballet and my son's in karate and, just like all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm curious, did fulfilling that vision that you had bring you fulfillment and joy?
Yeah, it did. It brought me again, both, right? Like it
Okay.
brought me fulfillment and joy in this hand and burnout big time in this hand. Because on
Mm,
top of all that, it was also like really struggling to get the business going and bringing it to
yeah.
the next level and to the next level.
Yeah. Okay. I'd love to just talk a little bit about your first marriage, that relationship, and bearing in mind, I know you've said you're very open to sharing all this, but I understand some of this history may be painful or difficult, and also for listeners as well. If you've
Mhm.
found yourself or find yourself in an abusive relationship, was that dynamic, the control, the abuse, was it always there, or was it something that started after you had children? And did it become sort of exacerbated over time?
It definitely did become exacerbated over time. The relationship was a really interesting dynamic of first, this older man dating someone that was like it just shouldn't have happened, right? That was
Yeah.
underage, but everything he did made me feel so loved because I was so like lacking love by my own parents. So
Yeah.
I viewed so much, not so much, all of his behavior as like, he loves me so much. He doesn't want me around anybody else. Like that's literally how I viewed it.
Okay.
Which now when I see these things, I'm like psycho. But at the
Yeah.
time, I really viewed it as he loves me so much.
Okay.
And it drew me closer to him and it drew me into a very codependent relationship.
Okay. I'm curious in terms of the nature of that abuse, and if you're open to disclosing it, was
Mhm.
it physical, like verbal, emotional? Was it all of those things?
It was all of those things. There was not a whole lot of physical abuse just because I did what he said, because I knew if I didn't, there would be physical abuse. And there was,
Yeah.
right? Like, so he showed me. So
Yeah.
it was like, because a lot of people who know me now are like, Angela, you wouldn't take that from somebody. And I'm like, look, when you are 16, 17, 18, 19 years old
Yeah.
and the biggest thing that kept me there was I don't want to be like my mother who was married and divorced 4 times, which is a stupid reason to stay. Because who cares how many
Mm,
times you're married and divorced, right? But that
yeah.
was my big thing was like, I am not going to be her. I am not
Mm-hmm.
going to be that. I am not going to give my kids that experience. I'm going to be better. I'm going to be better. And with that thought process came, well, I'm going to sit here and just, he was very jealous. I mean, at the time I was very, very into church. Even if I took too long at church, he would get jealous and accuse me of things. Later on during the relationship, when I started doing my own inner work, when he would get worked up, I would say, I'm getting in the car and I'm just going to go for a ride for you to cool down. He tried to drive me off of the road. So it
Oh my
was
gosh.
literally like being in a prison. And I
Yeah.
say, when I was 16, and I went to live with him, my friend Gretchen, her parents offered me to stay in their house, but they had a very strict Christian house. And I was like, I'm going to be like, I'm in a prison there. I don't want to move there. I'm going to go here where there's freedom. And I
Mm.
literally walked into my own prison.
Okay, so the two of you now have 3 children. It's a controlling, abusive relationship. I'm interested, how much of this do you think, and probably your hindsight's different than what you saw at the time, but was happening behind closed doors, so to speak, and how much of it was happening in front of your children? And how did you contend with that? Like, was there a point where you're like, my kids being subjected to this or seeing me subjected to this is worse than potentially ending this relationship or, being the divorced woman or what have you? What was that like with the kids?
Yeah, I mean, that's another complex thing. So shortly into my marriage, I'm going to say when I was about 20, 21, my great grandfather who raised me came to the house and said, if you want to leave, I will help you buy another house. And I just wasn't ready. And I was like, no, why would I do that?
Mm.
And I was upset with him. And I like so regret that now. And so the kids saw everything, but I tried to really cover it up with a smile and a hug and like for me, I think I looked at it like growing the years I did live with my mother and seeing her getting physically assaulted by her husbands was not really happening to me at the same rate. There was like, I
Okay.
could count on one hand when he got physical with me over, like 11 and a half years marriage and 13 years together. And so I really downplayed, and I think we do this in society a lot. I really
Yeah.
downplayed all the other abuse. And I don't even think I saw it at that time as abuse. I didn't. It was just like, he has a temper,
Mm.
or like, he loves me so much. He's just like, he's jealous like this. Like, it was just a lot of sugarcoating on my part
Yeah.
because I just saw abuse as like physical and not emotional. And I don't even know if I knew that that was a thing then because I was so young.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you say to someone who thinks or suspects or knows that they're in an abusive relationship right now, and they're simultaneously deciding or thinking that they may have children with this person? What would you say to them?
I would say leave before you have children, because part of the reason why I stayed for so long, because I tried to leave, like before I left, there were times where I got up and did leave for a short periods of time. But, you know, I was like, what am I going to do? I have everything with him. Everything is wrapped up in him. All the money, the house, the business. Like I have to start all over again with 3 children.
Yeah.
And so I would say, honestly, do not have children with anybody who's abusive with you, because when you leave, that abuse and that abusive behavior does not stop. It goes right into family court, and it goes right into, you know, the abuser will use your kids against you and will do anything and everything that he or she can do to do that, to hurt you.
Yeah. 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 I've seen this play out with a couple of friends of mine. And, you know, we think about having kids as like, oh, it's this big irreversible decision, which of course it is. But I think if there's ever a decision that is going to get you stuck for the rest of your life, I mean, at least to a degree, it's having kids with the wrong person. It's having kids, specifically someone who is abusive, controlling, domineering, because you are effectively connected to that person, at least until your kids are of age, right?
I mean, even then, like when your kid has a wedding, that person's going to be there. When your kid has kids and there's, you know, holidays you want to spend with them or birthday parties, like that person is most likely going to be there.
Yeah. So if you've been listening to the Kids Are Child-Free podcast, you might be thinking, wow, Kelty asks such good questions. Now, maybe you're not thinking that, but I have had multiple people say they really appreciate the questions that I ask the guests on the podcast. And if you would love for me to put my thinking cap on and to ask you thoughtful questions to help elicit connection with your own desires and help you figure out what it is you want when it comes to your kids or child-free decision, you're definitely going to want to check out my one-on-one coaching offers. I work with a select number of individuals each and every month to help them get clear on the choice that is right for them, whatever that may be. If you want details on how we can work together, you can head to kidsorchildfree.com. I will also link directly to the page where I have details on my one-on-one coaching work if you want to check that out. And if you're curious about how this all works and whether it's the right fit for you, you can also book a complimentary 30-minute call with me where we can talk about your unique situation, where you're struggling with this decision, and how I can help you in the form of one-on-one support. Okay, so at what point did you leave the marriage yourself? I know the marriage ended. You left. Okay, and so what transpired? And I'm presuming like you took the kids with you. What was the situation there?
Yeah. So after trying to leave a couple of times, my Aunt Nancy got on the phone with me and she said, "Ange, I know you want to leave, but you have 3 kids. You can't just get up and leave. You need to put a plan together." So I say this to anybody listening that wants to leave, you need to put a plan together. Now, I will say my plan didn't go exactly planned, so we had a business together and I was going to leave it a year and a half earlier than I did. But I kind of stopped dead in my tracks because our business got this big account with a big insurance company that I had been working on for 4 years. And I was like, okay, I can't leave now. This is my big chance. And I stayed. And not only did he continue to abuse me and burn me out, but this new account that I thought was going to be so great, while it's again holding space for both, it was great because it brought in large chunks of money, like it skyrocketed our income. So that is part of what helped me to be able to leave. But in this hand, that business the growth of it also was burning me out. So it really pushed me to the point of, I'm not doing any of this. I am done with the business, because the business is what also kept me there, right? Like everything was intertwined. It's like, I worked so hard for this. I knew that I would have to walk away from everything because he would just sabotage everything for me.
Yeah.
That's what abusers do. And so I was like, right, I need a plan. So what's my plan going to be? And I had started seeing a nutritionist because my older son had ADHD, and we were working through changing foods and stuff like that. And we were having such great progress with him that I started seeing the nutritionist, and I had a lot of progress, but it came to the point where she was like, look, something else in your life is not causing you to have 100% healing. And you're going to need to figure out what that is. And I know that she knew what that was, but she was like, you're going to have to be honest with yourself. Right.
Yeah.
And the minute she said it, I knew I need to get out of this marriage. But again, it was like this weight of like, I have to get out of this marriage with 3 kids, and I'm going to have to leave everything and start all over again. And it's not like I had a degree to say, well, I have a social work degree that I'll just go get a job here. Like I didn't have that. And, so I was like, what am I going to do? And like, I could have started another cleaning business, but I was like, I don't want to do any of this. Like, I want a completely different life, doing what I want to do for once. Like if I'm giving everything up, because we also had acquired other real estate property, and we had like, you know, rental property. So I just was like, I'm starting from, if I'm leaving everything, I'm going to do what I want to do. So I thought about it, and I always loved cooking. And I thought to myself, well, how am I going to convince him to allow me, because that was the only way it's going to happen, to go to culinary school? And so I had to think about this whole scenario. And I was like, I'm going to tell him, you know, you're getting older and you're going to continue to get older. And this physical labor is a lot on you. And would you let me go to culinary school? Because I want to start a business where we make healthy, like snack bars for kids. And like, I came up with this kind of like whole business plan on how we would do it. And it is something that at the time I was like, I would love to do this. And it was so funny because when I asked him, like, would you allow me? He said, would I allow you, Ange? Come on. And I was like, is this guy serious? He runs every aspect of my life. Like if I go to Walmart twice in a day, he's flipping out and saying I'm cheating on him with somebody in Walmart. Right. So, so we found a culinary school. I found one that specialized in like health conscious cooking. And my original plan was, I'm going to go to culinary school. I'm going to finish, and then I'll leave with the kids and start my career and start over. So I started going to culinary school, and it was in New York City. And, you know, there's just a vibe and an energy in New York City that it's just like the world is yours. There's every opportunity. Like there is a vibe in New York City that just is really inspiring. And as I was going, like I was just like, he saw it in me. And so he started doing what he does and would call me like the minute school got out and keep track of me. And like, you know, first, like he would just watch every move. Like, I'm going to drive you to the bus stop. I'm going to pick you up. You know, where are you? Blah, 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 blah. Until one day I had made friends with this woman who was an escort. And I always say, you never know what your angel that comes in your life may not be doing very angelic things. And she was truly my angel. And we had gotten out of school like a half an hour early, and her and another person, a male friend, he was also married, was like, hey, like we're out early. You want to go have some cocktails and some fried calamari at the place down the road, right? Like normal things to do. And I was like, yeah, sure. And, you know, I'm going down to the restaurant. We're sitting there, and now it's the time where school should have ended. And so here he goes calling me. And so like I clicked to voicemail, and he's calling, and I clicked to voicemail, and they look at me and they're like, are you ever going to pick that up? And I was like, oh, sure. You know, and I pick it up. I'm like, hi, I'm stuck in the subway. And so they're looking at me like, why we're sitting in a restaurant. Why is she saying she's stuck in a subway? Yeah. And they could hear him like screaming and threatening me. And I hung up the phone, and they both looked at me. They're like, how long has this been going on for? And I was like, pretty much since day one. And I said, that's actually why I'm really here in culinary school, because I plan when I finish to leave. And this woman that I made friends with looked at me and said, no, you're leaving today. And I said, I can't. What am I going to do with my kids? And she said, they can come stay with me at my apartment in Manhattan. And I said, you have a 1 bedroom. I have 3 kids. Like, I can't do that. You know, they've always been in schools, like in the suburbs. This is like, it's too much for them and it's not reality. And she's like, what about your mother? And I said, well, we don't have a good relationship. We haven't spoken for like a year and a half. And she's like, let's just call her. And so we go back to her apartment and I'm arguing with her about not calling my mother. And so I message my mother and I'm like, I want to leave, Eddie. And she's like, okay, I'll help you. And then Eddie's nephew called and said, what's going on? He's flipping out. And I said, George, I need to leave. I can't do this anymore. And his nephew and my husband at the time had an older son who's also like, Dad, you need to chill. Like, she's going to leave you one day. Like, you bug out for no reason. And so his nephew actually helped me leave. And he said, look, stay at your friend's house, make a plan. I'm going to calm him down. I'm going to tell him to come to my house tomorrow and then quickly go. I'll be in touch with you when he leaves, and like, just grab what you can grab and go. And that's what I did. The next day I woke up. I didn't go to culinary school. The director that I worked closely with from the culinary school called me and I didn't pick up. And then she called my friend that I was with and we acted like we were sick. And she was like, listen, don't lie to me. I got a really disturbing phone call from Angela's husband threatening that he was going to kill her and I'm going to call the police. And I wish I would have let her, but I begged her not to. And I was like, it's just going to make things worse. I'm just going to go get my kids. And she goes, look, 2 years ago, this same scenario happened with a woman who worked here and we didn't call the police and he killed her. And that was a very real reality for me. And I said, she said, keep in touch with me every single step of the way. I said, I will. And my friend was going to come with me. And then there was another woman in the class, really tough Israeli woman. And she was like, Angela has to do this on her own. And I was so angry at her at the time because I was like, I don't want to do this alone. But she was right. I needed to. And I did. And I got in my car and my kids were there and he was gone. And, we lived in a very secluded area around a lot of woods. And I really didn't know if he was going to hop out of somewhere and harm me, And I sat my kids down and I said, when daddy hollers and screams or sometimes hits mommy, and I tell you, because they would get upset and worked up and crying and try to come to my rescue. And I said, and I would always tell you one day we're going to leave. Well, today is the day. Here are 2 garbage bags. One, put all of your favorite toys, and one, put all of your clothes. And we got in the car and we went to my mother's house and hid in her basement for a while and changed the kids' school. And I finished going to culinary school. And as I would walk the streets of Manhattan, I didn't know if he was going to come out of anywhere, out of any, there are people everywhere in Manhattan and do something to me. It was the easiest place for him to harm me and just blend in. But I really was at the point where I was like, F it. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die doing what I want to do for once in my life. And luckily, he didn't harm me. And I was able to rebuild my life. And it took a lot. And there was a lot of rebuilding with my kids and their trauma around it and things I didn't know happened. And even after he had gotten, after I came out of hiding and I let him, have visitation with the kids, because again, there's this and this. There is for my kids, my dad is an abuser and I watched him do this and that to my mom. But in this hand, I love him and he's my dad and I want to see him. Right. So there were both of those things. So it was a lot.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for sharing this with us. And I mean, just how incredible. And I know, this is many years ago now, and yet I'm sure in some sense it feels still very fresh or raw. Were you, you were obviously understandably very afraid for your personal safety. Were you at any point worried about the kids and what he might do to retaliate with the kids or that he would abuse the children? Or is that something that had been happening?
So, yeah. So, Abuse with one of my kids did come out a couple years after I left him. And it was 4 years of in and out of psychiatric hospitals. And sadly, he never went to jail for it. And that happens a lot because in order, at least in America, for somebody to go to jail, the victim has to testify in front of the accuser, in front of the abuser. And my child was so young and constantly trying to commit suicide that the district attorney's office was like, I am not putting that child on the stand because if she takes her life, like we just can't do that. And that was a very, very hard pill for me to swallow. Very. And the judge even granted my ex-husband, even though CPS, which is Child Protective Services, came in and said, we do believe there was sexual abuse. We do believe it's true. We do want full custody awarded to the mother and blah, blah, blah. The judge was like, the children can see him if the children want to. It does have to be supervised and he will have to pay for it. But even with that ruling, I was besides myself, to say the least, in court. And he came out positive for serious drugs in his drug testing. And, so that's one of the other parts of having children with an abuser is the court system is not really there to fully say what is in the best interest of the child. Yeah. And they believe that any relationship with the other parent is important regardless, which is scary.
Yeah. If you're open to sharing a bit about it, I know you'd mentioned before we spoke about the mental health issues your daughter had. I wasn't aware, and certainly there's a lot of reasons people can have mental health struggles, but if she was a victim of abuse, that makes a lot of sense, right? And what ensued. You mentioned that your daughter was in and out of psychiatric care, and I mean, can you just talk to us a little bit about what that's been like as a parent, how you've been able to navigate that, feelings of, I would imagine great personal responsibility. And yet this is also an autonomous human who is now an adult, correct? Your daughter is in her 20s now?
25, yeah.
Yeah. What has that experience been like?
It's been very difficult, very emotional. She had 13 hospitalizations, pretty long one within 4 years. And so it was really the fight to keep her alive because it was a lot of suicide attempts because of the trauma. And the big T trauma, at least from what she says, happened when I wasn't around during visitation. And there was a lot of guilt, There's, I've lived most of my life since then, all of it really, with so much guilt and anger and, the what ifs and, her trauma and her pain affected all of us. Like it wasn't just her. It wasn't just me. It was also my boys, and they were put on the back burner a lot. Of course, because she really needed me and I had to really be there for her just to keep her alive and fighting in court with her father. Because, abusers and narcissists are pathological liars. My old therapist used to say master manipulator, which is absolutely the truth. Such a master manipulator. And, it's one of those things that when she was a kid never crossed my mind. Like having her, like when people have kids, we're not like, we see this beautiful baby, or even before we see them, when they're in the womb, we're just thinking about like T-ball and like tutus and like our dreams being lived out through them.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're never thinking about, well, what happens if like my worst nightmare happens and I find out my child has been abused in the ultimate way of abuse. And how do we work through that, and how do we live through that, and how do we heal through that and repair through that. And it was a lot. It was, I mean, I can't explain like all the mixed bag of emotions of having gratitude for all of the social workers and therapists and people in the psychiatric hospital who were like amazing and just don't make enough money for the work they do and really cared and loved my daughter while she was in there, like in the most ultimate way. And having the anger with the court system and just being so burnt out from trying to, because actually, so when all of that came out, I was already with the person who is now my second husband, and I had had my fourth child. So I had this new beautiful baby and this new life. And, you know, he was really put on the back burner because I was just constantly, you know, bringing my daughter and visiting her. I never wanted her to feel abandoned. So I was like going to see her every day and working through different therapies and different things. And it's extremely draining and emotional and complex. And, you know, also trying to get my other kids in therapy, which was also very hard. You know, they were teenagers at this time, you know, early teens. And it was a really, really difficult time in my life.
Yeah. Wow. I want to go back to, so you left your first husband. When did you start dating, and what was that like to feel like, and maybe you weren't actively dating when you met your now husband. I'd love to just hear briefly about that. But I can only imagine how difficult that must have been after your experience to not only think about creating a new connection for yourself, but to be welcoming another man into your children's lives. So how did that, you know, kind of I guess the brief version of the story, how did that play out?
You know, it's interesting because a friend of mine had said to me early on, like, wow, Ange, you know, I can't believe how open you are to love after what you've been through. And it was weird because it was like, I didn't even work on it. I just really left that part of my life behind. And I started dating, you know, pretty early on, not a whole lot of people, and nothing really serious. I would say the person, my husband now, Anthony, that I ended up marrying, like, it was funny because I was dating him and I didn't even know it. So it was like I was in the city finishing culinary school, and my friend, who I say is like my angel, you know, she really helped me to like she saw just how like beat down I was. Yeah. And so she would do my hair and put makeup on and like throw one of her dresses on and be like, come on, you know, we're going to go out. And so, you know, I was living in my mother's basement, but my mother lived even further away than where I was living. So my mom would be like, stay at your friend's house a few nights a week so you don't have to commute every single day. So the days that I would stay over her house, we would go out clubbing in the city. And I was like a bird out of a cage that has been trapped for a long time. And I was just like, wow. And I would just go out dancing and just literally be in my own world, like just lost in the music. And, you know, I dated, you know, I went out on a couple dates with guys in the city. And then, you know, it was time that culinary school finished and it was time for me to go back to my life full time in the suburbs. And actually how I met my now husband was we went to school forever, and his mother and my stepmother were actually really good friends in high school. But we ran in different crowds. Like I was always the party girl and he was the band guy, not rock band, like marching band. Right. So those two people don't really hang out, those two groups of people. So when I finished culinary school, a friend of mine was like, what are you going to do now for work? And I was like, I'm going to figure that out. And I literally worked 3 jobs. So one of them was, teaching kids cooking classes at a non-for-profit, which is where my now husband, he ran the non-for-profit. He's also a chef, and he was not only running a nonprofit, but he's also doing the cooking classes for the kids, but he was about to open a restaurant. And so my friend was like, do you remember Anthony? Like, he's opening a restaurant. There's no way he could do all of these jobs. And I was like, she's like, maybe you could take over his cooking classes. So I went, I spoke to him. He was like, oh, this would be great because the kids love it. And I would always invite him out to like a party I was going to or something. And he'd be like, oh yeah, sure. Never come. And then he came one Christmas. It was my first Christmas without my kids. I was at my friend's house, and one of my friend's parents' friends were talking to me, and I was like, oh, I always ask Anthony to come out and he never does. And he was like, you ask Anthony to come out and he doesn't. Call him right now and tell him to come. And so I called him. He came hours later, and we made plans to like go out to a restaurant. And from that restaurant, it went to another restaurant. And like, after a few months, my friends were like, so how is it going dating Anthony? I was like, oh, I'm not dating him. They're like, really? Because you're always going out to dinner with him, and we asked you to do something. You're not doing stuff with us anymore because you're doing stuff with him. And I was like, oh, wow, I am dating him. Okay. So it was kind of funny.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay. And so, okay, we talk about the kids or child-free decision. Of course, it didn't really go down like that with your first, well, presumably second and third children, perhaps, or at least maybe your third. Were any of those, would you say, like a decisive, I'm going to have another kid, or was all of that?
No, not for my first batch of kids, I'll call them.
Not for your first round. Okay. Batch number 2. Perhaps this is where the decision point comes into play more. First of all, how long were you and Anthony together before, or unknowingly dating before there was a commitment? And then you have one child together, correct?
Yes.
Okay. How and when did that decision get made? Did you plan to have more kids? Did you want to have more kids? I know these are a lot of questions, but how old was your youngest at that point?
So, okay. So here's the other plot twist to my story.
Okay.
So my youngest at the time was like 11, 12, I'm going to say.
Okay. And this is your daughter?
Maybe 13, my daughter. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And that pregnancy was also not planned. So Anthony and I had been together like a year and a half, I'm going to say. Mm-hmm. And here's the good guy. And
sorry, this is youngest. When you say that one wasn't planned, that was your third with your first husband, or that was with Anthony?
None of them were planned. We could just wrap it up to say none of them were planned.
We know how this works now, though, right, Angela?
Yes.
We're clear? Okay.
Yes. So my youngest was my daughter. So she was like, I'm going to say she was like 12. Okay. And now I find out I'm pregnant with, we were just dating, we were together, we lived together. And we're about a year to a year and a half in, and he freaks out and leaves.
When you found out you were pregnant, or just in general?
I found out I was pregnant with his kid. Yep. Okay. So here's the good guy, the nice guy. And he freaks out and leaves. And I'm like, okay, so now here I am pregnant with a fourth child by myself. And I just did what I do, right? Like he moved out. I paid the bills. I couldn't really sustain myself with all the jobs I was doing. So I ended up getting one job at a place. It was actually at a juvenile facility. And I was scared. I was like, here I am, a single mom. It's hard enough with 3 kids. Now I'm going to have a 4th kid. And I did go back and forth a lot with, should I have this child or should I terminate the pregnancy? But I really, really wanted to have this child.
How come?
I don't know. There was just something in me. And now that he's here, he is like the joy of my life. And I think it was just something deep in my soul that, and actually, there was a point where I was like, I am going to terminate this pregnancy. And somebody I worked with actually, and it was a man, said, don't do that. Don't do that. God will be with you. And I was like, yeah, you say that now. How am I going to take care of 4 kids on my own? Like, yeah, he'll pay child support, but still, child support really isn't enough money. It really is. And it's supplemental income. It's not a lot. And I went my whole pregnancy, and this man that I worked with, who I became very close with, said, give him a call. And I was like, why? He doesn't want to be a dad. And if you saw my husband, you would really be like, I can't believe this guy did this. But so I just reached out to him through text and said, I'm going to have the baby in a month. And I don't even remember exactly what I said, but he was like, can we talk? And I was like, okay. And we met at a diner, and I already had totally shut him off. And, he snapped out of whatever like serious fear he had been in and said, I want to be more than, just a father to you two. And I was like, wow, I totally like shut you out of my life and like was ready to move on and just like be a mom to a 4th kid and like send you to hell. And I left like with all kinds of emotions, but really like, really? Now this guy wants to change his mind. And we had agreed to meet a week later. And I was still like, I don't know why I'm meeting him. And we met again. And I was just like, look, I moved on. Like, I got you out of my head and out of my life. And I'm ready to just do this by myself. And he knows my love of food. So he was like, oh, can I bring you for ice cream here? And then like every time I wanted to leave, it was like, oh, I know you love the burgers there. Can we go there? And I ended up going into labor that day.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so
a food frenzy sent you into labor.
Yes. And so I had an emergency C-section, and he was there, and we called his mom, and she showed up and was like, what happened? And I was like, I had the baby. And she was like, oh my God, you look amazing. And then it was a lot of healing and repairing that relationship from then on. Yeah.
No kidding. And what, I mean, when he left, he was just like, this is too much. I don't want this. I don't want to have a kid. What was his reasoning?
I still encourage him to go deep into that, because I think it had a lot to do with like what you talked about in the beginning of this episode of like people who have had really bad negative experiences with their own parents decide they don't want to be parents. And his mom is a wonderful person. His dad, not so much. And there was a lot of abuse there. And they stayed married for like 50 years. His dad passed away now, but there was a lot of untalked about abuse. That even now he's realizing, wow, my dad was really abusive to me, to my brother, to my mother, to the people around him. And I really deeply think that that's what it was about, is like, I'm not doing this kid thing. And I will put my part in it, where I, at the time, like had a lot of my own trauma that I was trying to work through. I was a lot as a person then. I had a lot of, I reacted. Now I'm somebody who I've learned to respond. And I think he felt like, I do not want to have a kid with somebody like this. So I take my ownership in this, because from the trauma of childhood and then the trauma from my ex-husband, there was like a whole lot of trauma that I had to heal. And it comes out in your actions.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me about life today. You've got 4 kids. The youngest is 12?
12 and a half, yep.
12 and a half. Okay. And your eldest?
He's just turned 28.
Wow. Okay. And you're a grandma.
Yes.
Which of your kids has kids? Or
my daughter.
Your daughter. Okay. And you have 1 grandchild?
2.
Wow. Okay. So, I mean, how are the kids today? How's life today? How's being a grandma?
Yeah. So today and at this moment, everybody is well. And that's how I've learned to live as a parent, is being grateful for every single day. Because last year, my oldest son was diagnosed with cancer, and he had to go through treatment, and we had found out that the cancer spread a lot. And, he's doing well now. But there was that, and that sent me to a very dark place. My daughter has her times still where she's good and then not good. And she has really helped me live in the moment. And
Mm-hmm.
so when we're having good periods of time, it's like, I'm grateful for this day and this moment. And when she's not having the greatest time, I have really stepped in to help a lot with my grandkids. And that has been
Mm-hmm.
something I've had to really maneuver through is, really that codependency of this is my part and what's not my part and what am I doing authentically and what am I doing with regret and
Mm-hmm.
stop doing stuff with regret. And it's a dance. It's always been a dance with her. And she has been my biggest teacher and has sent me on my biggest deepest spiritual walk and continues to do so. But
Yeah.
at this moment, she's doing great. My second oldest is a hairdresser and he's just gay and fabulous and amazing and was over my house last night watching the Golden Bachelorette and we're going out to dinner on Friday. And my 12-and-a-half-year-old is like, it's a different kind of parenting. Number one, when you're older, and number two, when there's one and not three.
Yeah.
Because when there's three, it's like you're just overwhelmed by like all of these children. It's like there's a lot of them and they're all the same age. So it's not like one could help the other one. Like it was almost like having triplets. So just having my little son, Anthony, and also being in a relationship that's like healthy and not abusive and, and also being honest and being true in my parenting to him, right? Because he plays clarinet really well and he's involved in lots of different things with that. And he's a really good soccer player and I have to really be like, I'm not going to every soccer game because I may want to do something else because that's a lot of what parents get caught up in is like living your life just for your child and not having any time for yourself. So I did that with my first three, mostly out of like guilt and shame and wanting to be. And now I'm like, no. Like, because I realized that whatever I mirror to him is like what he's going to expect from his significant other when he grows up. And it's like, no, people have lives and I'll go to this game, but I'm not going to that game because I want to go here instead and let me know how it goes because you should really be on that field playing soccer for you, not me.
Yeah. Yeah. You've mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that you're now approaching parenting quite differently than you had. And it sounds like there's, I guess, a different sort of intentionality, not to say you weren't intentional before, but you're acting from a place of like, what's ultimately going to serve, I guess, all of us, myself and the kids, as opposed to just trying to be and do the things that you didn't have in your own life when you were a child.
Absolutely. Like I'm not trying to be the soccer mom. I don't want to do that. That doesn't make me happy. And the soccer moms try to reel me in and I'm like, that's not me. Like, 20 years ago, I would have died to be that because I wanted to be the perfect mom and I wanted my kids to, like what I thought my kids wanted for me. And I think a lot of times we think our kids need all of these things, but our kids really need us to be present.
Yeah.
And authentic and real and honest.
Yeah. You've had, it's been quite a journey. There's been a lot of growth. It sounds like there's been a lot of pain. There's been missteps. There's been learnings. What would you say have been, well, let me say this. If you were to do one or two or three things differently, what would those things be? And what would you not change for anything?
Oh, that's such a good question, right? Because again, there's this hand and this hand. I wouldn't have had my children early because I would have liked to go after some of my dreams when I had more energy and more umph. And also, when you're in your 20s, you're not even thinking of what could go wrong. You're just like out there doing it. And that's what I did in my 20s. But I think instead of doing it with a cleaning business, I would have loved to do it with what I really wanted to do. I really wanted to be interior designer. I wanted to, try my hand at being a dancer on Broadway. And I would never give up my kids. I love them to death. But I would have loved to have them with a different person, my first group of kids. with a different person. I would have loved to have those group of kids with my husband now.
Yeah.
And he has been a dad to them. He was the one where, when we moved together, and especially when my daughter was in psychiatric hospitals, he paid the whole rent because I was like, I can't work 3 jobs. Like I can only bring in so much, and I wasn't getting child support. Right. So,
yeah.
And if I could very early on learn how to be more mindful and not be all over this place and screaming at my kids in my 20s, and I would have, gotten into that earlier, I would have loved to.
Yeah. When you say that, what is it that's really been like the change maker for you in terms of how you approach parenting and your entire life?
I studied Buddhism. I don't consider myself a Buddhist. I just study Buddhism and yoga and meditation for many years. And it was actually my daughter's continued suicide attempts that brought me down that path. Because it just really did. It kind of showed up right before. And then when all of that happened, I was like, I need to go back to that yoga studio. And one thing led to the other and really, brought me down that path to help me even now be a more mindful parent. And even as I study it, studying it and living it are 2 different things. And living it is a practice.
Yeah. It is and it's the hard part, right?
It is the absolute
studying
hard
it's the
part.
Easy part, the theory.
Easy. And, even though I've been studying this now for 12, 13 years, I always feel like, oh, look at Angela, you're back to square one, you're doing that again. Yeah. I don't remember if I answered the question or not, but.
No, I was just curious. I can't remember what the question is actually. What was I curious about? I'm curious about it all. Okay. I could talk to you for a long, long time. I mean, there's so much we can talk about here. I just, first of all, really want to thank you for sharing your story so openly and candidly. And I would love for, perhaps I can ask you, and I'm going to do my best to discover some resources as well. But for people who are listening, specifically who've resonated with this story of being in an abusive domestic violence situation. I don't know if maybe there are resources that you could share with me that we can put in the show notes if anybody's needing support, if they find themselves specific to the States. I say it's challenging in the sense we have a very international audience, but I'd love to maybe have, whether there's a couple of websites or helplines, or maybe nowadays there's apps that people can turn to if they find themselves in a similar situation as you were in.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the National Domestic Violence Awareness Hotline, which I don't have the number offhand, but you can always Google it, will help with local resources. And I would say that is like the first stop. Think about a plan. And if you're in a domestic violence or any kind of abusive situation, I always say, I don't tell people what to do, but I'm going to say this is the exception. Please don't have children with this person because there's a whole life out there waiting for you. And there's a person that if you do want to have kids, there is somebody out there waiting for you to have children with you in a much healthier way and situation, because that violence and that abuse it affects the child for his or her lifetime.
Yeah. All right. Before we wrap up, I have 5 rapid fire questions that I ask all of my guests. Okay. So the first 2 are finish the sentence. Being a mom is
the greatest gift in the world.
Being a mom is not
the easiest thing.
What is one tool or resource that you think might help people who are on the fence about whether or not to have kids to help them make their decision?
Off the top of my head, Dr. Shafali is coming to mind. I think she has really great insight for people to think about, and her approach to, parenthood and raising kids. And, that's where I would kind of shift people to some of her teachings.
I will include her website in the show notes if people aren't familiar with Dr. Shafali, but I know she specializes or focuses on conscious parenting, I believe is what she calls it. Yeah. Which, the more we can do all things in our life with consciousness and deliberation, intention, I think, and love, the better. What is one thing that you want child-free people to know?
That you should not feel shame at all. Don't let anybody ever shame you. I think the greatest gift you can give to the world is to be honest about what you do and don't want. And don't let anybody and their old paradigm thinking let you believe that your choice of not having a kid is wrong.
Thank you. Truer words have never been spoken. Okay. And lastly, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence about whether or not to have kids, what would that be?
I would say give it time and don't rush it, because it is a decision that I always joke with people, but I'm like, you can't send them back. I've tried, So I would say take your time. There is no rush, and really, make the decision when you have a full body yes or no.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much for coming on. If people want to connect with you, something about your story has resonated, they want to reach out and thank you, what's the best way for them to get in touch or to find you online?
I would say on Instagram, it's at Angela, AngelaCCOMANDO.
Perfect.
And you could DM me
Angela
there.
Accomando. All right. And we'll also make sure to link to that in the show notes for today's episode. Thank you so much for coming on, for sharing your experience with us, your wisdom. I know it is very much appreciated by all of our listeners and certainly by me. So thank you, Angela.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in for this latest episode of the Kids or Child-Free podcast. I hope you found that conversation insightful and valuable. And if you did, I have a special request to make. And that is, I would be so appreciative if you would go leave a review or a rating over on Apple Podcasts or leave us a rating on Spotify, both of which can be done via the Apple Podcast and the Spotify apps on your mobile device. If you go do that, that is going to be a huge help in helping the Kids or Child-Free podcast get discovered by more listeners, more people like you who are on the fence seeking clarity with this decision. So hop on over. I mean, if you're listening on your device, you're probably there right now. It'll quite literally take you anywhere from 10 to 20 seconds. Leave us a rating. Again, you can do that on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Or if you're on the Apple Podcast app, you can also leave us a review with some kind words sharing what you think about this podcast and why you suggest other fence sitters should tune in. Thank you in advance for doing so, and I wish you a beautiful rest of your day.